Millionaire CEO kneels to help a girl. Bullied for her shoes. Moments later, her identity stuns him. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and carries the faint scent of fallen leaves. When Ethan Cole, a millionaire CEO known for his sharp suits and busyness, strode down the sidewalk toward a charity meeting. The sunlight filtered through branches touched with gold, scattering shifting patterns on the pavement as his polished shoes clicked steadily, a leather briefcase in his hand. His mind was already on the meeting agenda, calculating numbers and weighing negotiations, his watch ticking steadily to remind him of his schedule. As he passed the familiar brick wall of a small elementary school, the distant sound of children's laughter drifted over the iron gates. At first it seemed light-hearted, the usual sound of recess, but then he caught a sharper note, mockery hidden in giggles. His brow furrowed as the laughter grew louder, accompanied by taunting voices. He slowed his steps, curiosity tugging at him, and turned his head toward the schoolyard. Through the bars of the gate, he saw a cluster of children in a loose circle, pointing and whispering. In the center stood a little girl, her head bowed, shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Her sneakers, once white, were so worn they seemed barely able to hold together. The soles flapped with each step, and one lace hung loose, dragging in the dust. Every time she shifted her weight, the sound of the flapping sole seemed to invite more laughter from the crowd. "Look at her shoes!" a boy shouted, sparking another round of snickers. Her cheeks were flushed, not from the chill, but from embarrassment, yet she bit her lip hard, holding back tears. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her small frame swallowed by an oversized sweater with a fraying cuff. The children's voices rose like a tsew, chorus, each cruel remark pushing her further inward. A girl in the circle whispered something to her friend, both giggling and pointing again. Ethan felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. He'd faced arrogance in boardrooms and ruthlessness in deals, but the sight of cruelty in children unsettled him deeply. A breeze rustled the girl's hair, a few strands falling into her face, but she didn't lift her head. The teachers nearby were distracted, their backs turned. Ethan's grip on his briefcase tightened. He wasn't a man who stopped for strangers. His days were planned to the minute, but something about this scene rooted him in place. The girl's silent dignity, her refusal to cry, struck him like a memory he couldn't quite place. Around her, the jeering grew, one boy stomping the ground in exaggerated imitation of her broken shoes. The group erupted in laughter again, and Ethan's jaw tensed. Sunlight shifted, casting the gate's shadow across his feet as a bell rang faintly in the distance, ignored by the crowd. The girl bent slightly, as if to tie her lace, but stopped, too aware of their eyes. A gust of wind sent dry leaves skittering toward her, one catching under the peeling sole of her shoe. She glanced down briefly, lips tightening, as more laughter rose around her. Ethan's pulse quickened. He remembered, too clearly, what it felt like to stand alone. Her eyes flickered toward the street, landing on him for the briefest moment before darting away. In that glance, he caught something, determination, fragile but fierce. She was holding herself together with all she had. Her shallow breaths carried even to where he stood, each one quick and controlled. He took a step toward the gate, the world narrowing to her small figure in the center of that ring of voices. The sound of their laughter pressed at his ears, but it was no longer what he heard most clearly. More than two. A noise more than the cold air. He felt something shifting deep inside him, and in that moment he knew he couldn't just walk away. Ethan's fingers brushed the cold metal of the gate as he pushed it open, the hinges giving a faint creak that drew a few startled glances from nearby children. He stepped into the schoolyard with a quiet, steady stride, his polished shoes crossing the dusty ground without hesitation. Conversations paused, laughter faltered. The teachers, still distracted a few yards away, looked up only briefly, their expressions caught between confusion and recognition. Ethan's gaze never wavered from the girl standing in the circle. Her head tilted ever so slightly as he approached, as though she couldn't quite believe he was walking toward her. The air between them seemed to still. the chatter around them dissolving into a muted background hum. He stopped just in front of her, the sunlight falling over them both, casting their shadows long across the cracked pavement. Without a word, he set his briefcase down gently beside him and lowered himself onto one knee, his tailored suit brushing against the dust. The contrast between his immaculate clothing and the gritty ground was striking, but he didn't seem to notice or care. A few children shifted uncomfortably, their smug expressions flickering with uncertainty. "May I?" he asked softly, his voice calm and warm, the kind of tone that made even the air feel less heavy. The girl blinked, her lips parting slightly before she gave a small, hesitant nod. Her eyes followed his movements as he reached for the loose lace, his hands steady and deliberate. With care that seemed almost ceremonial, he threaded the lace through each frayed eyelet, pulling it snug without tugging too hard. Dust clung to his fingertips, and he brushed it away without breaking his focus. The flapping sole was tucked neatly so it wouldn't catch on the ground. His other hand smoothed the bow into place, making sure it wouldn't come undone easily. Around them, the ring of children began to loosen. Whispers replaced laughter, curiosity replacing mockery. The simple act, quiet and unhurried, carried a weight they could all feel, but perhaps didn't understand. Ethan glanced up at her as he finished, his expression free of pity, only a kind of respectful acknowledgement. "You should hold your head high," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Shoes don't make a person. Heart does." For a moment, she simply looked at him, as if trying to measure the truth of his words. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile, yet real. The faint tension in her shoulders eased just slightly, like a knot being loosened. Her eyes, though, told more than her smile. They held something deeper, something layered with untold days and silent struggles. In their dark depths was a quiet resilience that spoke louder than any words she could have said. She straightened her back by a fraction, the tiny movement almost imperceptible, but enough for Ethan to notice. A stray gust of wind lifted a few strands of her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of chalk and playground dust. He rose slowly to his feet, dusting his knee absently, though he didn't take his eyes from hers. Around them, the schoolyard had grown strangely still, the earlier jeers now replaced with a watchful silence. Even the boy who had been the loudest seemed unsure, his gaze fixed on the ground. The girl's fingers twisted briefly in the hem of her sweater before falling still, her attention locked on the man before her. For that moment, it didn't matter that they were strangers in every practical sense. What mattered was the unspoken understanding passing between them, as tangible as the sunlight warming their faces. Ethan reached for his briefcase again, his movements calm and deliberate, but he didn't step away just yet. The girl's faint smile lingered, though her eyes still carried the weight of a story he had yet to hear. Somewhere beyond the gates, life went on, cars passed, birds called. But within the schoolyard, time seemed to hold its breath, and in that stillness, something unspoken began to take root. Ethan adjusted the strap of his briefcase, a faint breeze catching at the edge of his jacket as he prepared to step away, but something in the girl's expression anchored him in place. Her faint smile had faded, replaced by the guarded stillness of someone who had learned to keep her world private. His voice came gently, almost as if afraid to break whatever fragile trust had formed. "Where's your mom or dad?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between them. The girl shifted her weight, the toes of her worn sneakers brushing lightly against the pavement. Her gaze dropped for a moment before lifting to meet his, a flicker of hesitation passing through her eyes. "My mum works a lot, and I don't have a dad," she said, her tone steady but stripped of the innocence most children's voices carried. It wasn't the bitterness of complaint, but the flat acceptance of someone who had lived with absence long enough for it to become ordinary. Ethan studied her for a beat, reading the spaces between her words, the faint tremor that came and went in her lower lashes. The schoolyard noise seemed distant now, the laughter and shouts of other children blurring into the background. There was something about her composure, like a book bound tightly, its pages unread by anyone else, that made him want to know more. Her fingers tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small, practiced movement, as if it were easier to occupy her hands than endure his gaze for too long. Before he could form another question, the sharp clang of the school bell rang out, slicing through the stillness like a sudden command. Around them, children began to scatter, the circle dissolving into streams of small bodies rushing toward the doors. The girl stepped back instinctively, a flicker of reluctance crossing her face, though her posture remained composed. She lifted her hand in a shy, almost tentative wave, an acknowledgement that felt both grateful and fleeting, before turning and slipping into the current of students. Ethan watched her go, the movement of her small figure weaving through the others until she disappeared entirely into the brick building. For a long moment he stood rooted where he was, the chatter and footsteps of the other children barely registering. When he finally stepped toward the gate again, his pace was slower. His mind caught on the image of her, small yet unbowed, her dignity wrapped around her like an invisible shield. He had met countless people in his life, business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, but none had left him with the quiet, lingering pull that this girl had in a matter of minutes. As he reached the sidewalk, the city resumed its usual rhythm around him. But inside his thoughts, the schoolyard scene replayed again and again. The frayed edges of her shoes, the measured way she spoke, the way her eyes seemed to carry both strength and a story she hadn't told. These details clung to him with an almost physical weight. Even as he made his way toward the charity meeting, shaking hands and exchanging practiced smiles, his mind wandered back to her. Numbers and reports blurred in his vision. Polite conversation felt like a language he couldn't focus on. Every so often, he would glance at the people around him, but none of their polished appearances could erase the image burned into his memory, a little girl with quiet eyes, standing tall in shoes that barely held together. That image followed him into the afternoon, into the hum of traffic, into the quiet of his office. It was as if she had stepped into a part of his mind and quietly refused to leave. A week had passed, but the image of the girl had not faded from Ethan's mind. It lingered like a photograph pinned to the walls of his thoughts. That evening, he found himself in the softly lit ballroom of a downtown hotel, the venue alive with the warm hum of conversation and the clink of glassware. The charity dinner for single mothers had drawn a mix of donors, advocates, and guests dressed in their best, the scent of polished wood and floral arrangements weaving through the air. Ethan moved among them with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to such gatherings, exchanging polite nods and listening to brief introductions. A string quartet played gently in the background, the music wrapping the room in a layer of refinement. He was midway through a conversation with a fellow sponsor when the entrance doors opened, letting in a cool draft from the evening outside. His eyes drifted toward the movement without much thought, and then stilled. A woman stepped in, her posture upright despite the weariness etched into her features. Her eyes carried a tired depth, framed by the faintest traces of sleepless nights, yet her presence was calm, almost graceful. She wore a simple dress, not new but carefully chosen, the muted fabric falling neatly to her knees. Her hand was clasped tightly around the smaller hand of a child. And that child, Ethan's breath caught, was the little girl from the schoolyard. For a heartbeat, the rest of the room seemed to fade, the chatter dimming in his ears. The girl's gaze swept the space, darting past unfamiliar faces until it landed on him. Recognition lit her features instantly, and her lips parted into a bright, unguarded smile. "Mom, that's the man who fixed my shoes!" Her voice, clear and certain, carried enough to turn a few heads nearby. The woman at her side looked toward Ethan, her expression shifting from mild confusion to sudden stillness. For a moment, she simply stared, her brows lifting slightly as though her mind was scrambling to place a memory. Something flickered across her eyes. Shock, yes, but also a trace of something older, something unspoken. Ethan's gaze stayed locked on hers, the brief hum of background music suddenly feeling distant. A strange sense of familiarity stirred in him, though he couldn't immediately grasp why. She gave a small, uncertain smile, almost as if she was bracing for him not to remember her at all. The girl tugged at her mother's hand, leaning forward slightly, still smiling at Ethan as if the rest of the evening didn't exist. Around them, guests continued to drift between tables, waiters moved with trays of sparkling water, and the steady murmur of the event continued. But for Ethan, the ballroom had narrowed to just the three of them. He excused himself quietly from the group he had been speaking to, taking slow steps toward them, each one feeling heavier than the last. The woman's hand tightened protectively on the girl's, her eyes flicking to him and then away again, as though weighing whether to stay where she was or turn and leave. When he was close enough, he offered a polite nod, his voice warm but carrying a trace of curiosity. "Good evening," he said, the words sounding formal even to his own ears. The girl beamed at him in reply, while her mother studied him in silence, the flicker in her gaze deepening into something he couldn't yet name. They found themselves seated at the same round table, the soft glow of candlelight casting gentle shadows across white linen and polished silverware. A waiter poured water into their glasses, the faint clink echoing in the brief silence between them. Conversation began slowly, tentative at first, as if both were carefully testing the ground beneath their words. The girl, Lily, he would soon learn, sat between them, content to nibble at the bread on her plate while glancing curiously from one face to the other. As courses were served, the woman finally offered her name in a voice that carried both caution and a quiet strength. "Claire," she said, watching him closely for any sign of recognition. The name stirred something faint in his memory, a thread he couldn't immediately place. But as she spoke of her younger years, details began to connect. Small towns, familiar street names, the sound of laughter from long ago. Then she mentioned his brother, and the thread pulled taut. His late brother's name, spoken softly across the table, brought an unexpected heaviness to his chest. Claire's gaze lowered briefly, her fingers brushing the stem of her glass as she continued. She told him they had been in love once, years ago, before a misunderstanding had driven them apart. She hadn't seen him again after that night, and soon after, she had moved away. Ethan listened in stillness, his mind struggling to reconcile the past with the woman sitting before him now. Her voice caught slightly as she admitted she had discovered she was pregnant not long after leaving. She hadn't told anyone in his family, not out of spite, but because she had convinced herself they wouldn't want her or the child in their lives. Ethan's eyes shifted to the girl beside her, her small hands now resting neatly on her lap as she hummed quietly to herself. Claire's next words landed with a weight that silenced the faint murmur of the room around him. "Lily, she's your niece." For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air, suspended, before they sank in fully. His chest tightened, his breath stalling as the truth wrapped around him. Images from the schoolyard returned in sharp focus. The worn shoes, the quiet strength, the way she'd met his eyes with more courage than most adults could muster. And now they carried a different meaning. The sting behind his eyes came quickly, unexpected and unguarded, and he had to blink to steady himself. He had walked past a schoolyard thinking he'd helped a stranger, not knowing he had been kneeling before his own family. The thought gripped him with an ache that was both painful and profoundly grounding. Claire watched him closely, perhaps expecting anger, perhaps expecting nothing at all. But all he felt in that moment was a deep, unshakable sense of connection. Lily looked up at him with a small smile, unaware of the shift in the air, her innocence untouched by the complexities between the adults. Ethan's hand rested on the table near hers, not quite touching, but close enough that she noticed and inched her fingers toward his. When her tiny hand settled in his palm, warm and trusting, he didn't pull away. Something unspoken passed between them, something that felt like the first thread of a bond long overdue. The background music of the dinner faded in his awareness, the conversations at other tables becoming little more than a blur. In that moment, the noise of the world seemed far away, leaving only the quiet truth that had just been laid before him. From that day forward, Ethan's mornings no longer began with silent rides to the office or endless phone calls before breakfast. They began with the light patter of small footsteps running toward him, Lily's laughter echoing through the hallway as she clutched her backpack and called out, "Uncle Ethan, hurry, we'll be late." The man who once scheduled every minute of his day now found himself slowing down, matching his stride to a little girl's pace as they walked side by side to school. Each morning, he'd watch her skip ahead, her new shoes tapping on the pavement, and feel an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He no longer saw her as just his niece. She had become a bright spark in a life he hadn't realized was growing dim. After dropping her off, he often lingered near the school gates, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to see her turn one last time and wave. In the evenings, Claire would be waiting with tea, and they'd talk, not about business, but about Lily's drawings, her favorite stories, or the way she scrunched her nose when she was thinking hard. Slowly, the walls Ethan had built around himself after years of loss began to crumble. Weekends were no longer for golf or late-night meetings. They became picnics in the park, afternoons baking cookies that somehow ended with more flour on Lily's face than in the bowl, and movie nights where Lily fell asleep halfway through, curled up under Ethan's arm. Claire, too, began to change. The strain in her eyes softened, and she smiled more freely, sometimes catching Ethan's gaze and holding it for a moment longer than before. It was in those quiet exchanges that something unspoken grew between them, something rooted in gratitude but blooming into something warmer, deeper. Ethan found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't dared in years, imagining birthdays, school plays, and family trips where order replaced the constant hum of work. Lily, blissfully unaware of the changes she had set in motion, only knew that she was loved, by her mother, and now by the uncle who had entered her life like a storybook hero. On one sunny afternoon, as they sat in the backyard watching Lily chase a butterfly, Claire glanced at Ethan and whispered, "I'm glad you stopped that day." Ethan's reply was simple, but full of meaning. "So am I." In that moment, he realized that his world, once defined by boardrooms and deadlines, had been remade by the small hand that now rested comfortably in his. And as the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the three of them, Ethan knew this was no temporary chapter. It was the start of the life he hadn't even known he was searching for.